Research Administrators. I am back from NCURE Nationals. It was absolutely fabulous, but as always happens on the way back, sitting on the plane, you've got your business cards from everybody that you, oh, this is the back of them, the business cards from everybody that you got. You've got your notes, my notebook's over there, like tons of notes, and a long list of things to do. Oh, and also going back to work now, which means that at work, I'm going to have to do that job as well. So there's a lot of things that are happening right now in my work life that I'm like, oh my God, how do I deal with all this? I remember for many years in my professional career, I knew that I needed to prioritize. It's a term I used all the time, and we all do. But I didn't actually have a framework by which I prioritized things. So the way that I typically would prioritize is something would come across my desk, and I would have to take this entire situation in its merits and say, okay, what am I going to do? Where does this fall on the list? So I had this long to-do list that I was constantly kind of like reprioritizing, which takes a lot of mental energy. And so that's like that app that we talked about in episode 2, where, you're now draining my battery power just trying to prioritize so that by the time I get to actually doing my tasks, I'm exhausted. That actually happens to a lot of us a lot of the time because tools for prioritization are not something that we're traditionally taught as part of our education curriculum growing up in high school or college or whatever. Nobody sits down and tells you, okay, this is what prioritization is. This is this is a framework or a toolkit to help you prioritize. Rather, we're just told you need to prioritize. You need to make sure you're prioritizing, as if that's a skill that is innate in a human being. Now, I realized about 10, 15 years ago that I actually was like, I kept saying prioritization, I kept talking about prioritization, but when it came down to it, I actually didn't really understand. I didn't have a framework that allowed me to prioritize easily and quickly. And so I didn't understand how what's the word? Actually, it's not that I didn't understand. It was I didn't know how to prioritize in a fast way that would allow me to quickly get through my workflow so that the prioritization activity itself was not exhausting me. So I did some research at the time, and Steve, if you read Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he developed the Eisenhower Matrix based off of Dwight Eisenhower's prioritization statement that he said many years ago in 1954. He said that I have 2 kinds of problems, the urgent and the important. The urgent are not important, and the important are never urgent, right? So that was his sort of general philosophy for prioritization. Stephen Covey took that and made it into more of like a framework, right? So where he created an Eisenhower Matrix that you see on your screen right now. So this box, this matrix that's on this that you're looking at right now is actually something that I've been using for decades, or well, about 15 years actually, to prioritize my tasks. So I want to talk a little bit about how to use this so that you can use it for yourself. But I do want to say that, like, though I used the grid itself when I first started, with use over time, I'm now able to prioritize sort of in my brain and be like, oh, that's not urgent. It's just important. And I can put it in my to do routinely, to do now, to do later list on my own. So I don't actually have like a grid as well as my to-do list my 3-list system. I only have my 3-list system, and that 3-list system is kind of broken up into the way that you would think about things, which is urgent and important, urgent but not important, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework in this video for Eisenhower's Matrix, just so that you have a framework for prioritization as you go through your day-to-day, with the understanding that as you go through it, you're going to mold it into your processes to make it fit for how you do things. So in Eisenhower's Matrix, there are 2 different types of things. We talked about the urgent and important tasks. Though those 2 may sound like the same words, I want to actually spend a little bit of time diving a little bit deeper in just to make it clear how different they are. So urgent tasks are tasks that require your immediate attention. When something is urgent, it must be done now. And if it doesn't get done right now, there are clear consequences of it not getting completed within a certain timeline. So for example, a grant submission whose deadline is at 5 p.m. today is going to be urgent, because if you don't submit it today, that is going to result in the grant not being accepted, and so on, right? So that has a real measurable consequence. But let's say, for example, you have to do a reconciliation or a labor cost transfer. Though those things are very important, if you don't do them right this instant today at this moment, it'll be okay. So you can afford to move that reconciliation to, say, tomorrow or next week because the grant is what is going to take priority right now. Right? That's one that we're all very good at prioritizing, because we all know that grants are always going to be at the number one. And that makes our lives a little bit easier because there are some priorities that are set for us by the nature of the activity that we're doing. These are tasks that you typically cannot avoid. So you have to be the one who does them. And the longer you delay them, the more stress you'll experience. So for example, if you have a PI who has a grant that is due by, say, October 5th, right, by 5 p.m., and that PI is delaying, as we get closer to the deadline, the urgency of this starts to increase because, and therefore the anxiety starts to increase because if we don't finish it by that time, there will be hell to pay, okay? So other examples of urgent tasks might include, handling an urgent request from a sponsor related to an FFR that's closing out in a couple of days. In your personal life, it might be something like fixing a busted pipe in your apartment. When all of the electrical outlets in my house exploded, that was definitely urgent. We need to take care of that immediately, right? So those are going to be your urgent tasks. Now you have your important tasks that may not require your immediate attention, but these are tasks that help you to do achieve your long-term goals. So for us, reconciliations are a really great example of that because reconciliations are critical. They are so important. They need to be done. They matter. But in the scope of a grant versus a reconciliation, the grant submission is always going to take priority because of that urgency factor that's related to it. So now that you know the framework for that, right, the thing that I want you to consider when you get tasks coming to you, just to sort of start to get your mind thinking in that direction, is this a task that has a deadline that requires me to finish it within this day, or do I have time to finish it? And the reason why this is so important is because what I've observed over the years is that so many of us get caught up in the urgency cycle because we have grants coming in, we have stuff that we have all these deadlines, that what ends up happening is that we can then start to loop everything into, like, everything starts to become urgent and important, and we start to flail around a little bit because we're on this momentum train of, oh my God, we've got to get so many things done. And it's like a dam that's burst over us in terms of all the things that we need to do. And I've been in that situation where it's like the dam opens up, everything falls on top of me, and now in my mind, everything is urgent and everything is important. And so I have to do everything right now, and that's where I start to like buckle under the pressure. Fortunately, this tool, whenever I start to feel that slight sense of anxiety coming in, this tool, I know that I have it, and so I'll actually pull it out and I use it because I recognize that just using it will allow me to distribute things into my, okay, I can do this later. Okay, this is what I need to take care of this week, and okay, I have time, and really start to plan a little bit more effectively how I'm going to manage my week proactively, and it starts to make me feel like I have a little bit more control over my day-to-day life, which is why this prioritization aspect is so important. The recommendation that I have for you is start with the framework as I've outlined it, but then you can adjust and modify as you're like, oh, that doesn't work for me at all, I'm going to switch this, and so on, and you'll be able to build your own system. So if you're looking at the chart on the screen right now, we're looking at, you notice that there's 4 quadrants. So you've got important and urgent on the left top. You've got not urgent and important on the top right, then not important and urgent bottom left, and then not urgent and not important on the bottom right. So for the top left, which is urgent and important, these are tasks with deadlines or consequences. So urgent and important are tasks that they need to be done deadline oriented, so now or by a certain date, and not doing them by that certain date will have consequences. So those are the things that we typically, if we know what those deadlines are, then it's fairly easy for us to prioritize because we're aware. But if this is something where, for example, you'll get a request from a PI to say, I need this done right away, right? So I got this request from a PI once asking me to pay an invoice for a publication, and like the email that I got made it sound like this publication was about to from the PI, made it sound like the publication was about to, reject the publication. They hadn't been paid in so long, like we had to take care of this right away. And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, no, absolutely. Send me the invoice. I'll take care of it. We'll pay it right now. And sends me the invoice. And I mean, all it really is, it says here, please pay it by this date. I mean, the date is like 15 days from now. Like we've got plenty of time. Like it's all good. But the PI, in their mind, this was like something that had to be done immediately. They wanted me to take care of it this instant. And though they may think that it is urgent and important and needs to get taken care of right now, I've got 2 grants due at 5 p.m. So this has to take a back burner. So it's important for one of the things that really changed my trajectory as an RA was when I started to not let someone else's urgency determine my level of urgency for something, and not to take for granted that them applying it and saying this has to get done by this date. That doesn't mean that if you look deeper, that may not be the case. That may just be their interpretation of it, or so on. So not everything is urgent and important, but many things can be made to feel like they are urgent and important. So one of the most pivotal, the most critical steps as part of prioritization is starting to let go of this idea that every single thing we do is going to be earth-shattering, right? There's some things that just, they're not earth-shattering, right? Okay, so things that are important but not urgent are things that they have unclear deadlines, and they typically will contribute to more long-term success. Like they're things that need to get done. Like maybe you need to update your portal with some information that needs to get done. It's very important to the workflow, but like it doesn't have to necessarily be done this instant, right? So these are tasks that, or for example, the reconciliation on a routine accounts that PIs, like you have a PI who there's no issues, no deficits, no transfers that have needed to be done in the last few months, and this PI is fairly easy to manage, right? So this person's reconciliations are going to be not urgent. They're important because they must be done, but you don't have to do them this instant. Whereas if you have a PI who who's having deficit issues and they're struggling with their spending, that person's reconciliations may need to come first, right? Because they're important, and they're also urgent because this person is struggling. So a reconciliation activity could be important and urgent in one situation, but important and not urgent in another situation. So again, it's important to be able to distinguish between those so that we're not putting everything in the important and urgent bucket, which ultimately leads to a high amount of stress in the workplace. When we get to the not important and urgent section, we're talking about delegation. Okay, so who can you delegate this to? These are things that do not require your specific skill set. And sometimes these are going to be things that you may need to work with someone in your department or someone, a manager. So for example, I was at an institution where the research administrators were doing a lot of the accounts payable work. And in a conversation, and accounts payable didn't want them doing that work, and they were frustrated and annoyed, but the RAs somehow at some point in the past, it had gotten that way. And so we all ended up having a conversation because everybody was feeling overloaded, things weren't happening properly, and we sat down and had a couple of conversations where we eventually realized that, okay, this task doesn't need to come from us, so how many of the RA tasks now we can move over to accounts payable? And then accounts payable realized that there were some things about research administration that they didn't understand. We were able to create a synergy that then took this task off of the RA's job altogether. So now this task that originally was like, okay, we typically put this on the urgent, and we put this on the urgent but not super important, ended up actually being in a delete for research administration because they stopped doing it altogether. So as you start to really reflect upon when something needs to be done, when something doesn't need to be done, whether it is urgent, whether it is important, and asking the question, how can I move this more into that bottom right corner? Because ultimately, what you really want to be doing as a research administrator is focusing on the things that require your subject matter expertise and that are urgent and important, okay? And that are not urgent and important. And the things that are not important, right, and not urgent, you don't want to be doing at all. And the things that are not important and urgent, you want to make sure someone else is doing because, again, that doesn't necessarily require your subject matter expertise. Over the years, we as research administrators have gotten a huge amount of the load of work, typically just because of the nature of our job. But what we are all finding now is that the workload, because of the administrative burden that's being placed on us by the changing guidelines and compliance regulations, our administrative burden it's getting higher, and it's getting harder and harder for us to do some of those tasks that we previously would have done and were able to do fairly easily because of the fact that we just don't have as much time. So either we need more people, or we need to redistribute the workload to various different places, and this is a great way to do that. And then last but not least is you want to look at the things that you can absolutely delete. So when you think about just some thoughts for as you're doing your own prioritization, one is when you're thinking about quadrant one, the ones that you need to absolutely do now, these are the ones that are both urgent and important. These typically are not going to be things that you have to question yourself about. Like for example, a grant submission, when I said that, you're like, yeah, duh, that's going to be a high priority. It's not going to be a surprise to you that ends up in there. However, there are going to be things that end up in there, right, that you have given more meaning to. So think about that. So think about the things that you can schedule, right? The urgency question is the one you want to ask, right? These things may be very important, but are they urgent? And if they are not urgent, then they can be moved into that later part of your 3-list system, which for me, I typically will either put it in the triage space where it's like, okay, I don't know when I'm going to do this. I know this is important. I need to get it done. So like I need to update a manual for our system. It's like, okay, I need to get that done. That is important, but do I need to do that this instant in the face of the other priorities that are in my queue? I don't really. So I can put this in a to schedule, to deal with later, and then my Asana to kind of create that hierarchy. But if you have Trello, a lot of people use Trello. That's a really great option as well. The key thing here is that quadrant 2 on the right-hand side. That stuff is typically stuff you can schedule. So when you look at it, even though in your heart you may be feeling like, oh my God, I got to do this, I got to take care of it, it's really important to go into the logic space and say, okay, when can I put this? The first few weeks of doing this are very hard because we are so used to thinking that everything is so urgent and so important. As you start to go through the process, more frequently and like it becomes more of a habit, it becomes easier and easier because when the world doesn't explode, when you don't get to some of these other things and some of the stuff you started to get off your list, you realize that, you know what, I had assigned a lot more meaning and urgency to these things than maybe I needed to, and I freed myself from that stress now by moving it a little bit lower down on the priority list. Okay, all right. Now the other thing you want to think about is delegation. Who are your resources, right? Where can you delegate to? What are your options? Some cases you might have an admin assistant, you might have someone in the department that you can leverage, you might have someone in accounts payable. I know that it's easy to say I have no one or I don't. It's like, it sucks because a lot of times we don't feel like we're supported or we don't feel like we have a place to go to. But if you go back to the question, I think we talked about this in the first episode is, all right, how can I make this work for me? How can I find a way to get support on this? It may not be something you figure out right now. Like I asked this question right now and you're gonna be like, there is nobody, right? And for 3 or 4 weeks, nothing pops up. But then you're talking to, Susie Smith in accounting and she says something about, John Doe, who suddenly you're like, oh my God, John Doe can help me with this. And now you have a resource, but you would not have thought to leverage John Doe if you hadn't actually thought about, okay, I'm looking for a person to whom I can delegate this task. So a lot of times the way that we think about delegation is, okay, I have a person and now I'm going to delegate tasks. That actually doesn't typically work. And the reason why that doesn't work is because when you have a person, you actually have to sit down then and figure out what task can I delegate. And that often will take time out of your day. And so many managers and leaders I've worked with will resist delegation, not because they don't want to delegate, but because they don't have the time to sit down and say, okay, these are all the things that I'm working on, and this is what I can figure out how to delegate. The way that I got around that was saying, okay, instead of saying, listen, I'm going to delegate all this stuff and like now I have a person, think about your work in this way anyway. So if you're thinking about your work always in terms of has to be done right now, can be scheduled, can be delegated, or can be deleted, then you'll already have a list of stuff that you are willing to delegate and can delegate to someone. So the second somebody jumps and says, second someone says to you, I have this resource, or there is a person in this department, you already have a list and say, oh my God, that's great. Can you give them this? As opposed to the other way where they say they have a resource and you're like, okay, yeah, I'll think about it, but you never really get around to it because you're doing all of this other stuff. So this is actually an incredibly powerful way to eliminate work from your plate, because once you start to build that quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, right, delegate and delete, you now reach a space where you already know what you can get rid of when the opportunity arises. I have never once worked with someone who had the time to sit down and do this work and say, okay, I can delegate all of these tasks. There's just too much stuff going on. So the question is, if we know that we don't have the time, what kind of systems can we build underneath the work that we're doing in the day-to-day that will give us what we need so that when we have the opportunity to offload our work, we can. Alrighty. When we pop up in our next video, we're actually going to talk a little bit more tactically about the research administration stuff that fits into each of these spaces. Alrighty, this has been fabulous. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions, pop those in the comments and I'm happy to help you out. And also don't forget to hit subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video.